Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is Magic from Zero. After watching the last couple of videos in this series, you should have a general understanding of how Magic operates, so now it's time to get a little bit more specific. Today's topic is casting a spell, and even if you're completely new, I hope it wouldn't come as a surprise to say that in a game called Magic, casting spells is a pretty significant part. In fact, I don't think most players would object if I said if you're not casting spells, you're not playing Magic. So, the very first and most important thing to know about casting spells in the game of Magic is that there's a defined process for it. To cast a spell, you need to follow a specific sequence of steps in a prescribed order. The full list of everything that could possibly happen is pretty long and bogged down with a lot of special carve-outs and rules that only apply in very specific circumstances, sometimes relevant only for a single mechanic, or maybe even if a specific card is involved. Fortunately, only a small fraction of the full list of steps is generally relevant for any given spell, so the process isn't as intimidating as it might seem at first glance. Now, there's been some variation between what some of the people who have covered this topic before me deemed significant enough of a step to count, but for me, casting a spell looks a lot like buying Magic cards. First, you get in line at the game store, then you make choices about what you want to buy, then the game store determines whether you can actually buy what you asked for, and then you determine and pay the costs. Each of these steps has an analog in the process of casting a spell, so let's take a look at that. Now, you can want more Magic cards at any time, but that's not enough. You aren't really in the process of buying them until you physically go to the game store and get in line. Likewise, the first step in the process of casting a spell is to move it onto the stack. If you've already watched my other videos in this series, you might remember that in Magic, spells don't resolve or have their effects happen right away after you cast them, which is how it works in some other card games. Rather, anytime someone plays a spell, everyone in the game gets a chance to respond to that spell with one of their own. Now, this requires some sort of a holding zone for spells that have been cast but have not yet resolved, which in Magic is called the stack. This name comes from a concept in computer science that functions exactly the same way. The analogy breaks down a little bit here because when you're in line to buy something at a game store, most of the time that's a queue, not a stack. People join at the back and the clerk serves the person at the front. In contrast, when you cast a spell in Magic, it goes on top of the stack, above any other spells or abilities that might already be there. This means it will resolve before any of them. The normal way for a spell to leave the stack is for it to resolve, but it's also possible to counter a spell which moves it into its controller's graveyard without having any of its effects. In the analogy that I introduced at the start of the episode, the next step was to make decisions. Now, if you're at all familiar with Magic, you know that when you buy cards, there are always some decisions to make. What set do you want? Are you getting a normal booster or a collector booster? Should you maybe additionally buy a deck box or a pack of sleeves in case you open something expensive? You've probably thought about all of this stuff before you go to buy, but these decisions don't get locked in until it's your turn at the till and you're talking to the clerk. Likewise, after moving a card onto the stack, you have to make choices for the spell. Even though this is one step in the process as I'm describing it, there are actually 3 rules in the comprehensive rules that describe various parts of this step, and 2 of them are pretty long. Fortunately, a lot of what's in those rules is not relevant every time you cast a spell, so in practice it's not as complicated as it looks. There is an official order for every specific choice that gets made when you're casting a spell, but in many cases there's only one way that makes sense because maybe one choice will reference the other in some way. Like, if you're buying a booster pack, you have to decide what set it's from before you decide whether to buy a collector pack or a normal one, because a lot of sets in Magic's history don't have collector packs. Most of the time, when you don't have some hint like that to fall back on, it's probably not going to matter what order that the choices get declared in, so don't worry about doing it wrong. The very first choice that you make for your spell is modes. Now, this Slagstorm is a modal spell, as is anything that has the instruction to choose, followed by a long dash and then some bullet points. Some older modal cards don't have the bullet points. Magic only started using those in 2014. To be sure, you can always look up the current text of a card using a website like Gatherer or Scryfall. After modes is a sequence of stuff that affects the spell's cost. The first of these is Splice. There's only a handful of cards that have this mechanic. Almost all of them are from 3 specific sets from the early 2010s. Of the cards with that mechanic that are still relevant today, none of them is relevant because of the Splice ability. But anyway, Splice is a mechanic that lets you pay an extra cost to splice the effects of a card from your hand onto a different spell that you're casting. Paying the cost happens later, but revealing the card with Splice from your hand happens here. Next up is other costs. Some spells allow or require you to pay an additional cost on top of the normal mana cost, or an alternative cost instead of it. These costs will actually be paid later, but this is the point where you would specifically state that you're intending to use them. Many keywords, especially keywords associated with instant or sorcery spells, will allow or require paying an additional or alternative cost in exchange for some kind of a benefit, such as an upgraded effect when the spell resolves, being able to cast the spell from a game zone or during a time when you otherwise wouldn't be able to, or providing a discounted cost if you meet certain criteria. If you're wondering what makes Splice special enough to get its own step ahead of this to handle it separately, well, the answer is kind of technical. I might make another video that specifically talks about that mechanic if there's enough interest, but it's well outside the scope of what I wanted to discuss here. When you're in this step, you might have a possibility to apply more than one additional or alternative cost, so it's important to know how they combine. It is only possible to apply one alternative cost to the casting of any given spell. It is not legal to cast a spell using two or more different alternative costs, which I guess makes sense because, well, that's what an alternative is. It's something that you could do instead of doing something else. In contrast, you can choose to apply any number of additional costs to the casting of a spell, and that's true whether you're using the normal mana cost or an alternative cost. After this are decisions about the mana that you'll be paying. The most common way for this to come up is with X spells. As you can see, this prosperity here does not have a mana cost that's just composed of numbers and normal colored mana symbols. There's also the X symbol. To play prosperity, you would have to decide a value for X before you pay the cost. This is the point in the process where you would do that. After that is deciding how you will pay for hybrid mana symbols and Phyrexian mana symbols. So if you have a look at these cards, you can see what I'm talking about. As the reminder text indicates, a hybrid mana symbol indicates a cost that can be paid by one mana of either of the constituent colors, and a Phyrexian mana symbol represents a cost that can be paid with one mana of the appropriate color or 2 life. There are even Phyrexian hybrid mana symbols which work exactly the way that you think they do. At this point in the process of casting a spell, if the cost that you're going to pay includes any Phyrexian or hybrid mana symbols, you need to say how you will be paying for each one. And after this is targets. If you've been playing Magic for a while, you've probably seen the word target on spells before. In fact, it was pretty hard for me to get this far into the episode without choosing any example cards that use that word on them. Many Magic cards use the phrase target something to describe what things that they will affect. There are a surprising number of rules related to targets. Most of them are relatively obvious, but the general gist of targets is that it makes sense to have to declare what you're going to do with the spell as you're casting it, so other players have an idea of whether or not it'll be worth their while to respond. Anytime you see the phrase target something, that means that you have to say what you're targeting during this step in the process of casting that spell. One thing that's not obvious is that targets are generally not optional. For example, have a look at this Bright Reprisal. You might not even care about destroying a creature. Maybe you just want to play this card to draw. But that's not possible. You need to target an attacking creature in order to cast this spell. If you can't do that, it's not legal to cast Bright Reprisal. Sometimes cards will include wording that makes one or more of their targets optional. The most common ways of saying this are up to some number of targets, or any number of targets, since 0 would be a valid choice of number. These are exceptions though. The default is if you don't see any language like this, you need to choose a legal target for each time that word comes up on the spell. Another thing that's not obvious is that sometimes you can choose the same thing multiple times when you're choosing targets for a spell. For example, let's say Nick controls 3 permanents. One is a land, another is an enchantment, and the third is an artifact creature. Can Amy use this Decimate to destroy all 3 of them? Well, as we already discussed, and as later printings of this card helpfully point out, you cannot cast the spell unless you have legal choices for all the targets. This means Amy must target an artifact, a creature, an enchantment, and a land. Now, if Amy really needed to, she could have Nick's land be the target land, Nick's enchantment be the target enchantment, Nick's artifact creature be the target artifact, and one of her own creatures be the target creature. Or maybe if Amy had an artifact she didn't mind losing, then she could target that and have Nick's artifact creature be the target creature. That would also work. But she can do better. It is legal to choose Nick's artifact creature as the target artifact and the target creature. Be careful, when you're choosing targets, you have to choose a different target for each individual use of the word target on the spell. So that one worked out in Amy's favor this time, since Decimate uses the word target 4 times. If there was somehow a permanent that was an artifact, a creature, an enchantment, and a land all at the same time, it would even be legal to decimate just that permanent if you really wanted to. But look at this hex. It says you have to destroy 6 target creatures. If Nick only had 5, it would not be legal to target one of them twice because the word target only appears once on the spell. That means it is not legal for any individual creature to be chosen as the target for this spell more than once. Here's a challenge question to test your understanding. Could you target the same creature 3 times with this Wrap of Flames? What about with incremental growth? Alright, so first up, we'll notice that Wrap in Flames only uses the word target once. This means it is not possible to target the same creature more than once. This card does say up to 3 though, meaning that not all 3 targets are necessary to cast the spell. If your opponent only had 2 creatures, it would be legal to cast Wrap in Flames targeting both of them without needing to target one of your own. Regarding incremental growth, we'll see that it does use the word target 3 separate times, which is a good start. Unfortunately, it says you need to target another creature for the 2 counters and a third target for the 3. That means you could not choose the same creature 3 times. Here's one last example. This Seeds of Strength uses the word target 3 separate times, and there's no additional stipulations on what you can target. This means it is indeed possible to target one single creature with all 3 buffs for a combined total of +3/+3. Now the last decision you make when you're casting a spell is any division or distribution. So here is a Flames of the Firebrand. Like we mentioned earlier, when you're casting the spell, you have to choose targets. It would be legal to choose 1, 2, or 3 targets when casting the spell. Next, you need to choose how you're dividing the damage. There's a couple of gotchas to watch out for here. First, every target needs to get 1 of whatever is being divided. It would not be legal to target your own Elite Skirmisher and deal 0 damage to it just to get to tap something. Another thing is that sometimes the spell itself specifies how the division will happen. In such cases, there's no choice that gets made here, and the division rather happens during the spell's resolution. So this Dwarven Catapult says it divides the damage evenly. You don't get any choice in the matter, so there's no decision to make. Now, if that seemed like a lot, it is. Fortunately, like I said, most spells only have 1 or 2 of these that are relevant for them, and it's almost always either obvious what order the choices get made in, or else it doesn't matter. After making all these decisions, the next thing the game does is evaluate whether it would be legal to cast a spell given the decisions that you've made. Think about what would happen if you jumped in front of the stack at your game store and asked them for a pack of cigarettes. Well, in a lot of cases, they would tell you no, because usually you need a special license to sell cigarettes, and the game store could not legally sell them to you unless they had that license. Now, you probably would have known about that before you even got in line, and indeed, the game checks legality before you start the process of casting a spell too. This Meddling Mage says you cannot cast spells with whatever name was chosen as it came into play. So you wouldn't even be allowed to move a spell with that name onto the stack. But there's also cases where you might want to buy a pack of the latest set and a green deck box, and when you ask the clerk for it, they'll tell you they're out of the green deck boxes. It was perfectly reasonable for you to expect that you might be able to buy something like that, but based on the decisions that you made, the store is not going to be able to sell it to you. Now have a look at the Sanctum Prelate. It says non-creature spells with mana value equal to some number can't be cast, while on the stack, X in a spell's mana cost counts towards the mana value. So if you wanted to cast a Blaze for X equals 1 while there was a Sanctum Prelate out naming 2, that would not be possible. The game wouldn't know that what you were about to do was going to be against the rules at the very start of the process of casting that spell, but this final check serves as one last failsafe. The last step in the process of casting a spell and buying magic cards is to determine and pay the cost. And like before, the big picture step is composed of a few sub-steps. First, you determine the cost according to the following process. Start with the base cost. This is either the spell's normal mana cost or, if applicable, the alternative cost you declared earlier in the process. To this, you add any cost increases. This includes additional costs that you noted earlier in that same step, and also external effects that make the spells more expensive, such as the Sphere of Resistance. After applying all these, subtract off any cost reductions, anything that makes the spell cost less. And there's also one card that sets the cast to cost spells. This effect applies after all of that. The result after all the appropriate cost modifications have acted is the total cost to cast the spell. Now, the important thing to know here is that after the total cost is calculated this way, it's locked in and it will not change. After we've calculated the total cost to cast the spell, you might expect the next step would be to pay that cost, but there's actually one extra wrinkle. You got to the stack at the game store, you decided to buy a collector pack of the latest set and a pack of sleeves, they had everything in stock, you applied all the taxes and coupons, now it's time to pay. Oops, you reached into your pocket and there's no money. You ask the clerk to hold on for a sec while you dash to the ATM. The same thing happens when you're casting a spell too. Just like a lot of people don't carry cash around with them unless there's a specific reason to, usually players don't have any mana in their mana pool unless they're about to use it. So right after the cost to cast the spell gets calculated, players have one last chance to activate mana abilities so that they'll be able to pay that cost. And after this, that's the time when the cost actually gets paid. Okay, here's a challenge question to test your understanding. Amy wants to play this Frogmite, which costs 4 mana, but has an ability that makes it cost 1 less for each artifact that you control. Her only permanent is a Black Lotus, an artifact that you can sacrifice to generate 3 mana. Can she cast Frogmite? Okay, so this doesn't work if Amy just sacrifices the Black Lotus for 3 mana and then goes to cast Frogmite. Even though Frogmite is an artifact itself, only artifact permanents that you already have on the battlefield count towards the cost reducing ability. When you calculate the cost to cast it, that cost will be 4, but you only have 3 mana. But there is another way that does work, and it relies on what we've just discussed. First, Amy says that she's casting the Frogmite. During the step where the game calculates the cost, she still has the Black Lotus in play, so the cost to cast this spell is reduced by 1. Then, during the step when she can activate mana abilities, she sacrifices the Black Lotus for 3 mana. After doing this, Amy no longer has any artifacts, but once the game calculates the cost, it's locked in. If Amy loses control of some of her artifacts after this point, the cost will not go back up. When the game progresses to the last step where Amy actually pays the cost will be 3 mana, and she'll have 3 mana from sacrificing Black Lotus. Amy's able to successfully cast the Frogmite. Paying a spell's cost is the last step in casting it. Some costs can include different types of things such as paying mana, sacrificing permanents, paying life, and so on. There's no set order for doing this. You can perform these actions to pay the cost in any order, with the exception that if any of the costs involve random elements such as rolling a die or milling cards from your library, these costs have to be paid first. After paying the cost, the spell is officially considered cast, and this is when any abilities that trigger when a spell is cast will trigger. These triggers, along with any abilities that triggered during the time that the spell casting process was happening, they're all put on the stack on top of the spell. I'll talk about this more in my video about how triggered abilities work, but the player whose turn it is puts all their triggered abilities on the stack first, in any order they want. Then each other player in turn order does the same. This means all the abilities that triggered during the casting of the spell will go on the stack on top of that spell and therefore resolve before it. But the relative order of these abilities that they resolve in, it's not dependent on what order their trigger events happened, which is maybe a little unusual. Whew. If you made it all the way here, congratulations. You should be ready to cast some spells in style. Let's cool down with a couple of challenge questions that I prepared to test your understanding. First up, Amy wants to cast a Fireball to deal 2 damage to Nick and 2 damage to one of his creatures. Describe the order of events that officially happens in the game. If you want a hint, I'll put the steps back up. Pause now if you'd like an extra challenge. Alright, so we'll just go right across. First up, Fireball is moved to the stack. The top ability is an additional cost, but Amy doesn't have to decide whether she's using it. It always happens. This means there's no cost-based decisions. Amy does need to decide a value for X though. Because she wants 4 total damage, she chooses X equals 4. Then she goes on to choose targets. Fireball says she can choose any number, so she picks 2, Nick and his creature. The last decision is to assign a division of damage, but this is not relevant here because Fireball says how the damage is divided. There's no decision to make. The next step, where something is actually going to happen, is calculating the cost. Because Amy chose X equals 4, Fireball costs 1 red mana and 4 generic mana. Amy has chosen 2 targets, so the top ability makes the Fireball cost 1 more. Amy now gets to activate mana abilities, and finally she pays 1 red mana and 5 generic mana. Now the Fireball is officially cast. Alright, let's try another one. Amy wants to use this Abzan charm to kill Nick's Phantasmal Bear and buff her own Grizzly Bears. How would that work? Okay, so after moving the Abzan charm to the stack, Amy has to make decisions. Remember how I said earlier how a lot of the time a spell will give you a hint as to what order the decisions are officially made in. Let's notice how the top mode of Abzan charm targets a creature with a specific power. The middle mode has no targets at all, and the bottom mode has 1 or 2 target creatures that can have any power. This suggests that the mode needs to be chosen first, before the targets, since otherwise how would you know what targets you could legally choose? For this example, we're having Amy choose the bottom mode. The next thing to do is to choose targets. Like we said earlier, Amy wants to target her own Grizzly Bears and Nick's Phantasmal Bear. Upon becoming the target of a spell, Phantasmal Bear's ability triggers. But remember what we said, any abilities that trigger during the whole process of casting a spell wait until after that entire process is completed before they go on a stack. Observe how, unlike Fireball, Abzan Charm does not specify how the counters are distributed. Therefore, Amy will need to say in the next step how to do this. Amy wants to buff her creature the most possible, so she says she'll put 2 counters on that and 0 on Nick's creature. The next step is to check for legality, and the distribution Amy proposed is not legal because all of the targets did not get at least 1 counter. Since the proposed spell was not cast in a legal way, the game returns to the moment before casting. The Phantasmal Bear is safe for now because no abilities trigger as a result of an undone action like this. Let's try that again. This time we'll have Amy propose a different distribution, 1 counter on each creature. With this, the spell passes the legality check and Amy can go on to pay the cost and cast the spell. After paying the cost, the Phantasmal Bear's ability is put on the stack. As noted before, it will resolve first, and after the Abzan Charm will resolve. It has only 1 legal target left, Amy's Grizzly Bears, so it will do as much as it can. 1+1+1 counter is put on that creature. We can see this trick would have worked out a little bit better with a spell like Fireball from earlier. Because its distribution is not decided during the process of casting, none of Fireball's damage gets wasted if some of the targets are no longer legal at the time it resolves. Okay, what about this? Amy wants to use Shard Volley to kill Nick's Lavinia Azorius Renegade. Her only land is a mountain. Is this possible? Okay, so to decide, let's go through the process of casting the spell, step by step. After moving Shard Volley to the stack, the first choice to make is targets. Like with what we saw on Fireball, the additional cost is not optional. Amy chooses Lavinia as the target. Next, the game checks if the spell is legal to cast based on the decisions Amy has declared. Since she has 1 land at this time, everything's a-okay. The cost is calculated to be 1 red mana in addition to sacrificing a land. Then Amy taps her mountain for that red mana during the next step. Finally, she gets to pay the cost, and her spell is cast. Even though the spell now has a higher mana value than the number of lands that Amy has, Shard Volley was legal when it was cast, so it'll resolve normally. Alright, here's another one. What is the difference between Harrow and Roiling Regrowth? Well, I imagine anybody who can read was able to see the only difference between the rules text of these 2 cards is that one says to sacrifice a land and the other says to sacrifice a land as an additional cost to cast it. But let's take a moment to appreciate exactly what that means. With Harrow, sacrificing a land is an additional cost, which means that you have to pay that cost during the process of casting it. You cannot cast Harrow unless you have a land to sacrifice. You lock in what land is getting sacrificed at an earlier time during cast, and if the spell gets countered, your land is still gone. In contrast, with Roiling Regrowth, the sacrifice is not part of the steps you need to do to cast the spell. The choice of which land gets sacrificed is indeed a choice that you have to make, but the list that I gave in this episode is an exhaustive one. Any choice that's not specifically part of that list is made during the spell's resolution, not during its cast. And therefore, the only cost to cast Roiling Regrowth is 2 generic mana and 1 green. If it gets countered, you won't have an instruction to sacrifice anything. And if you can somehow manage to cast this spell when you have no lands to sacrifice, you won't have to sacrifice 1 at all. The rest of the effects will still happen normally. Okay, here's one last example to close things out, and it's something we haven't talked about yet. You see the Skrelv? We're not going to cast it. What we're going to do is we're going to say that Skrelv is already on the battlefield, and you want to activate its bottom ability. What would that look like? You might be calling foul now if you're new here. I've only just touched on activated abilities in the series, but believe it or not, you actually already know how to activate them. That's because the process mirrors the process for casting a spell. So if you look at Skrelv's bottom ability, you can see it has a colon. Every activated ability has a colon. The stuff that comes before the colon is the cost to activate it, and the stuff that comes after is the effects, what happens as it resolves. There's no physical card associated with activating an ability, but the first step is still to put it on the stack. It's just an imaginary, invisible thing, but as far as the game is concerned, it still exists there. The first choice that we need to make is how we'll pay this cost. You can see the Phyrexian white mana symbol there. We're going to need to say whether we're paying 2 life or 1 white mana for that symbol. The other symbol is the tap symbol. Activating this ability requires tapping Skrelv just like you would have to tap a land to draw mana from it. Next, you have to choose a target. After that, you calculate and pay the costs. This is where you physically tap the Skrelv and either pay the white mana or the life as appropriate. And then the ability is activated. Notice how the colon makes it a little bit easier to distinguish what happens when you're activating versus what happens during resolution. Since choosing a color is after the colon, we can say that it's going to happen during the resolution of this ability. And a final note of closing. I think casting a spell is a difficult process for a lot of new players to grasp, not because it's overly complicated or because there's a lot of steps. That may be true for the full process, but schematically, getting in line, asking for what you want, checking the stock, and calculating and paying the costs is relatively simple, and the full process isn't much worse. I think the real culprit is that after getting used to this process, experienced Magic players condense it so much that it's hard to recognize each step as it's happening. To use that Skrelv example from earlier, most Magic players would probably just tap a planes, or adjust their life total by 2, point at whatever they're targeting, and say a color, in a haphazard or random order. If you're not familiar with the card or the process, it can be tough to identify why the Skrelv player is taking each of these individual actions. If your game has a mix of newer and experienced players, it may help to have everybody explicitly go through the steps until all the players get a hang of it. That's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.